Hi, I'm Nick Haig, and welcome to the World's Greatest Business Thinkers podcast. Greg Fisher holds the professorship in the Management and Entrepreneurship department at the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University, where he teaches courses in entrepreneurship and strategy. He's also a visiting lecturer at the Gordon Institute of Business Science, the business school attached at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. Greg spent a lifetime either launching different ventures or teaching students how to build, launch and grow new ventures. Through his lifetime of experiences, he's put together a fabulous book called The Principles of Entrepreneurial Progress, and I can't wait to talk to him today. If you've ever thought about setting up your own business, have tried and given up, or in the midst of setting one up and need some help, then this is certainly the podcast for you. And remember, if you like what you hear today, then delve back into the back catalogue of podcasts as there's some fabulous guests. But also remember to follow and subscribe wherever you watch or listen, as it really does make a massive difference to our podcast ratings. Welcome to the World's Greatest Business Thinkers podcast, Greg.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, to kick things off, I think it would be great to just, first of all, touch on your background. I've just given a bit of an introduction there, but you got into teaching entrepreneurship at the Kelley School of Business. How did that come about?
So born and raised in South Africa, and growing up in South Africa in the time that I did, went through a lot of changes and transitions and saw a lot of change happening, but ultimately landed up always passionate about business, but come from a family of teachers. And so landed up actually originally training as an accountant, but hated accounting. So quickly looked for a opportunity to pivot out of that, sort of got involved in training and development at Deloitte, and then went and did an MBA. And while I was in the MBA, the entrepreneurial bug bit me. Launched a business called Learning Lab in the sort of training and development space for large corporations. Grew that business and then exited from it about 2.5 years later. But during that time, I'd always kept sort of connections back with the business school I'd been at in South Africa. Right. And I always had this sort of notion that I could see myself in front of the classroom one day. And so at that point in time, pivoted into a career as a lecturer, and then realized that in order to do this more legitimately, I would need to go and do a PhD somewhere, and landed up doing a PhD at the University of Washington in Seattle, focused on entrepreneurship and strategy, got very embedded in the Seattle sort of entrepreneurial ecosystem, working with small entities, writing case studies, studying angel investing. So very intertwined there. And then from that point onwards, sort of became more orientated towards the academic side of entrepreneurship, both teaching and publishing academic research focused on the topic. But I've always had this inclination to try and bring those worlds together in the form of something which ultimately turned into a book.
Yeah, and we'll get into the book later on in the discussion. But I think I can see where you come from when you're writing from both sides of that. Both from you being an entrepreneur, but also from teaching, being a professor at the business school.
Yeah,
I think a good starting point, therefore, before we get into the book, is I'd like to know how you define entrepreneurship, and how do you think has that definition evolved over time?
So, I mean, I think where I've landed is on there being sort of these two anchor points to entrepreneurship. And the one is around opportunity and about the pursuance of opportunity, typically under conditions of uncertainty. And the other anchor point is around it being orientated towards action and the individual having to take action and to act. And so I define it broadly as the pursuance, exploitation, creation of opportunity through action. And I think those two aspects, that if you drop the opportunity piece and it's just about acting with no real purpose or with no desire to create something that's of value, then it sort of becomes purposeless and wistful. if you think about the opportunity, but there's no action attached to it, it sort of becomes an intellectual exercise of thinking about markets and so on. So I really think of it as the identification or creation of opportunity, and then the exploitation of that through action.
And would you say maybe a third leg to that stool, if you like, would always be, well, there's financial risks, of course, but it's in that hope of profit at the end of the day, or can some entrepreneurs just to be looking to set something up not for profit?
Yeah, so I mean, this whole notion of a profit motive is an interesting one, and we spend time talking about that both from an educational standpoint, from a research standpoint, and then from a pragmatic standpoint,
Mm.
because there is this whole world of what we sometimes refer to as social entrepreneurship or acting entrepreneurially in pursuance of value that might not be financial.
Yeah,
So social value, creating new institutions, those kinds of things. So when I'm teaching it, it's very often anchored on, I'm in a business school, it's very often anchored on and associated with a business with profit potential,
yeah,
and with economic outcomes. But when we talk about entrepreneurship more broadly, and when we think about all the different areas in which it might apply, higher ed institutions and people doing things that are entrepreneurial, or emerging economies and sort of solving social problems, it doesn't always necessarily need to have this economic piece attached to it. The value may actually come in other forms. And so I'm very sort of aware of there being these sort of multiple views of entrepreneurship.
yeah, yeah. What do you think are the biggest misconceptions people have about entrepreneurship?
I mean, I think there's a few things. I think one of them, and part of what I've tried to tackle, is that there's a recipe that you can use to become effective as an entrepreneur. Like there's a sort of single framework that if I read about this or I apply this in the way that it's been described, it's going to work in multiple different scenarios. And I find that it's much more valuable to think about it as a set of principles that you sort of got to understand and may or may not apply in different at different levels depending on where you're at, as opposed to a single recipe or a single framework. So that's one of the things. I think one of the other things is that some people think that entrepreneurs are just born and there's no nurturing, no development, nothing you can learn about being an entrepreneur. My both research and experience would suggest that there's actually quite a lot that can be developed through prompting people to act in entrepreneurial ways, through giving them exposure to entrepreneurial role models, and through nurturing just certain ways of thinking about problem solving and value creation, and pushing ideas forward. So I don't think that it's just about being born with a certain gene and you're suddenly an entrepreneur.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. As a fellow entrepreneur, I know sometimes it's the light shone on it as being this glamorous type lifestyle as well. But I think that's because we hear of all these successful people out there, and Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, all these people get rolled out. Whereas in reality, only a small percentage of ventures actually succeed, don't they? And in fact, I read something recently that 90% of startups fail, but almost all, and this is across all industries, but the average failure rate in year one is about 10%. But in years 2 to 5, it's a staggering 70% of new businesses that will fail. So, I mean, I think this entrepreneurial world that's sometimes glorifies failure as this learning experience, but one of those misconceptions does need to be that it can be costly, can't it? Financially, emotionally, socially, even. So sometimes we can't always celebrate failure. Obviously, we learn from failure, but there are some real consequences to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot in what you've just said there. The first thing is that for the majority of the time that you're working entrepreneurially on a new venture or trying to create a new product or service, it's not glamorous. It's
Yeah,
hard work. It's all encompassing. It can be very frustrating because things aren't working out as you might have envisaged them. And one of the reasons I sort of pivoted out of full-time entrepreneurship was, to be frank, I was probably burnt out because
Yeah.
it's really, really hard work. So that's one of the pieces that I think, we don't talk enough about the cost, both physically, mentally, emotionally, of pursuing an entrepreneurial journey. The second important thing that you say, which I think is highly relevant, is the high failure rates. But one
Mm.
of the interesting things we see when you step back and look at the data is, often the people who do land up succeeding, so land up breaking through, getting past that 5-year mark that you mentioned, have had 3 or 4 failures prior to that. So these failures don't need to be hugely costly. And very often, entrepreneurs go through 3 or 4 iterations, will start a business, it will fail. They'll then go and start something else, leverage all of those learnings. So even though you might hear numbers like 70% or 90% of new ventures fail, it doesn't mean that all of those have been a single person failing a single time. Someone might fail 4 or 5 times and then have a massive breakthrough that's
Yeah.
going to pay for or cover all of the prior failures. And so, when you start to look at the numbers a little bit more critically, it can be a little bit more encouraging, in the sense that an individual will try something, fail, and quickly learn from that, pivot to something else, fail again, quickly learn from that, pivot to something else, and suddenly have a breakthrough, and potentially have a life-changing outcome within not a short space of time, but within a reasonable space of time from a financial standpoint. So that's
Yeah.
sometimes what it takes, is an individual failing a few times to get the breakthrough to be successful.
Yeah. Well, you're right, and I suppose all entrepreneurs, well, they have a few things in common, and doggedness is probably one of them. But they obviously identify the opportunities in the first instance. They assess the risks, take action despite this uncertainty, and it's complex, as you say. It's uncertain and it is difficult, and often entrepreneurs, they act with this lack of information to guide them through the journey. But that is until now, of course, because your newly published book called The Principles of Entrepreneurial Progress is an excellent book that guides any wannabe entrepreneur through 12 principles. And this, I suppose we should point out at this stage, this isn't a step-by-step guide, is it? Can you tell our listeners about just a bit about the book, I suppose, and the importance of principles as opposed to a method or approach, like you say?
Yeah, the analogy I like to use is that of a expert chef. So I'm not an expert chef, or not very good at cooking. So if I've got to cook something, I've got to find the right recipe with all the exact ingredients and all the exact equipment, and just follow the instructions. And but it does mean I need to have everything set up in my favor. Now, the reality is, for most people who are, but an expert chef will open up the fridge, look at what ingredients are available, what equipment they've got, and apply principles of cooking and food preparation to bring those things together to create something that's unique, different, and no one else would have thought of. And I think that that's the kind of capability we need to be helping individuals develop, is sort of foundational principles of value creation, building new entities, moving forward in this messy, uncertain process, as opposed to trying to give them recipes. Because the challenge with entrepreneurship is no person is ever starting with the same set of ingredients at the same time, with the similar resources, pursuing the same opportunity. So to try and connect them in the form of a step-by-step guide or recipe is near impossible. Hence, I shift to this idea of fundamental principles that are, I guess, in some sense, more common sense, more core, more foundational, but can be applied across different scenarios in useful ways. So that's the notion of shifting from sort of methodology to principle, and then I'll break them down and sort of put them in different buckets. So it's a bucket of principles around value creation, a bucket of principles around action or entrepreneurial action, resources, and then sort of big picture or tying together ideas So that's the notion of shifting to principles as opposed to a single framework or a single recipe or methodology.
Yeah, I like that analogy. I can get that in terms of around cooking and professional chefs. So yeah, this principle is this underlying concept or theory that governs how something works, and it's it's a fundamental idea or belief that guides that mechanism, if you like, to working towards the success that you're looking to deliver.
Yeah, and I don't think about it as the sort of grandiose long-term success. I think about entrepreneurs as being successful from week to week to week. Like, it's what do I need to be doing this week that's going to move me forward in a productive way, that's going to allow me to learn, allow me to test things out, allow me to understand a little bit more about my market, my product, what I'm doing, as opposed to I think because of the concept of uncertainty, it's so hard to say in 5 years' time, this is where I'm going to be. The
Yeah,
reality is we just don't know, and it's near impossible to predict that. So instead, it's more useful to think in slightly shorter term bursts as to what are we going to do over the next day, week, maybe month to move us forward amidst all this messy uncertainty that we need to operate in.
yeah, yeah. Well, I know, having read the book, we'd need more than just this one podcast to go through all 12 different principles. But maybe what we can do is talk through the different buckets that you've just mentioned there that these principles fall into. So let's start up front then. There's something called the value bucket, and value creation is a discovery process. So what are some examples of principles that fall into the value bucket?
Yeah, so the value bucket is sort of the anchor point for the book, and it's got the most principles. So of the 12, six of them fall in. I've placed six of them in the value bucket, and at the very foundation of that is principle number one, which is the problem principle, and that's that entrepreneurial progress entails identifying a meaningful problem to solve. So it's not about thinking, oh, it would be nice to have this app, or it would be great to be able to, go out and eat this kind of meal. It's getting down to what is the pain point of the target customer? Why does that pain point exist? Who are they? When do they experience it? And really getting to grips with it so that you can build something that responds to that. And I think, and a lot of our work and engagement with entrepreneurs and research would support the idea that businesses that are built around solving problems, and quite often, not always, but quite often problems that the entrepreneur themselves has experienced,
Yeah,
um, are good starting points, are useful starting points. Now, one of the things about these principles is there are exceptions to the rule. There are people who get away without applying the principle and still create a great business. But on the whole, and when you look across the empirical evidence and the sort of anecdotal evidence, people who anchor on a problem to start typically start with a good foundation, are able to make useful decisions early on and target their business in a way that they can build something that creates value. And
yeah,
then the other five sort of principles in the value bucket sort of build on from that. So um, one of the things that I think is really important and sort of aligns with this idea of being willing to act, have a bias towards action, is the principle of building something early. So I call that the prototype principle. That instead of creating a business plan or running thousands and thousands of Excel spreadsheets or even doing tons and tons of online research, move to the place where you're building something as soon as you possibly can, some kind of prototype, something that looks like your end product or works like your end product or a combination of those things. And the practice of doing that, number one, allows you to learn what it takes to build that kind of product, whether it's a digital product, physical product, or even delivering a service. Number two, it allows you to put something out in the world, and the people in the world, or the sort of your customer set and your broader set of stakeholders, can give you feedback on what they think of that idea. And number three is it then marshals interest and intrigue from potential resource providers and others who might be able to support you on this journey. So those are two, the problem principle and the prototype principle are two important principles that fall in that bucket, and then they're supported by a number of other ones.
Yeah, yeah. And going back to the problem principle, which you like, is the starting principle. I'm a career market researcher, so I love the line you use around the problem principle. I think it was Steve Blank you referenced, but he says there's no facts inside your building, so you need to get outside. Facts live outside, and building where future customers live and work. And I think I love that. You know, I'm a career researcher, so I've always been asking questions, but those who, what, where, when, why principles frame the problem that you're looking to solve, and making sure that the customer is always central to what you're looking to deliver, as opposed to just, something out there that you just interests you.
Yeah, the notion of sort of go and see, go and ask, go and engage, I think is a big part of properly understanding that problem so that you can solve it in a way that's going to resonate with whoever you're trying to solve it for.
Yeah, yeah. And as you say, there's lots of principles we could talk through today. Just touching quickly on it, because you use so many great examples. And actually, so you need to build the prototype. But too often, I think people overcomplicate things. So there's one thing called the simplicity principle, and I didn't know about the early days of Instagram, how it had evolved. It was quite a complex location based check-in app called Bourbon, I think, something like that.
Yep.
Yeah, and how it just evolved, how they looked at how people were using it. Again, going back to what the customers is really looking to do, and they were only using one feature, which was this posting and sharing of photos, and hence they evolved it and developed it around that.
Yeah, we've got a natural human bias, and there's pretty strong empirical research to show this, that our natural human bias is to overcomplicate things, to add to things, to try and make them better, to always think that more is better. Like complexity is associated with substance and with value, and yet on on the user's side, or on the perspective other people who are going to use the product side, often it's the complete opposite. That something that's simplified, that's stripped down, that's quick and easy to understand is seen as much more valuable or creates much more utility. I believe Steve Jobs got this, and that was one of his superpowers, was recognizing that you strip things down to their core and deliver the user just what they need and nothing else. And that's what I'm sort of encouraging in the simplicity principle, is to subtract elements that aren't needed, to create simple and understandable explanations of what you're doing, and very much to focus on what is the user using and engaging with, and to strip out extraneous stuff that they don't actually feel they need, want, or desire.
Yeah. I think a really good example of this, and this is showing my age, but is the Walkman. So back in the 80s, when people were wandering around with headphones, it was the first time they could take music with them. So way before Steve Jobs and
And the iPod.
Yeah, exactly. But they didn't. They could have put a record button on there, couldn't they? But they didn't. It was just purely play, and sometimes just a fast forward, not even a rewind. But it was there to purely play music as opposed to trying to record as well. So they really got that when they were trying to design it.
And a part of that was just trying to keep it as small and light as possible. So a big part of it is weighing up, where does the utility really lie? Is it in something that's bigger with more features, or is it, in this case, in something that's smaller and more portable? And making that trade-off forced them to a position of simplicity, and that position of simplicity actually ended up being something of a strength. And just for those in your audience who don't know, it only had a fast forward button, which meant you take the tape out, switch it around if you wanted to rewind what you were doing.
Yeah. The good old days, hey. So next we have the action bucket, and this is about how founders should act and make progress on the journey. So we talked about the problem, we talked about prototype, simplicity, but in the action bucket, there's only two principles. So what are those two principles that guide action?
So this is sort of one of my big areas of research, and sort of passions. And so the two actions I talk about in the action bucket are, number one, what we frame or talk about as entrepreneurial hustle, and number two, storytelling. So entrepreneurial hustle is a sort of concept that has been spoken about anecdotally for quite a while, but has never formally been defined or even studied. And a few years back, myself and a bunch of my PhD students and collaborators sort of did a pretty in-depth study of successful entrepreneurial stories, trying to identify sort of actions that seem to be consistent patterns across these. And we ultimately landed up coming up with this idea of entrepreneurial hustle, which is acting with a sense of urgency and unorthodoxy, and combining the sort of notion of feeling like you're in a little bit of a rush. You need to get things done. It's important to get things done pretty soon. But in trying to get things done, you're not confined to the way they've always been done. You're willing to break the mold, operate a little bit outside of the box, be somewhat creative. So we frame it as a combination of urgency and unorthodoxy. And we've gone on from that and actually developed a scale of entrepreneurial hustle and been able to tie that to making progress on an entrepreneurial journey, to outside stakeholders being more interested in your business, and a whole lot of things that sort of validate that it's a valuable behavior. But at its core, it's an individual's inclination to act with a sense of urgency, feel like they've got to get stuff done, and to do so in a way that is outside of the norm or the sort of orthodox way of doing things. Yeah. And so it's one of the pieces of the puzzle that I'm certainly most intrigued by, passionate about, and have got, both in terms of my own research, the most empirical evidence to support it.
B2B Frameworks is a curated collection of proven business frameworks to develop your strategic thinking skills, solve your biggest business problems, and unlock your next promotion. Our mission is to help you achieve these goals. We want to create the next generation of successful business leaders by providing the tools and frameworks needed to create effective strategies that drive business growth. Each framework comes with a downloadable set of instructions with large, colourful diagrams and editable templates to guide you through the process step by step and prompt you to consider the problem from every possible angle. Along with audio guides and educational tools, our extensive content library is full of real-world examples and case studies of strategic thinking in action. So why learn with B2B Frameworks? We've carefully curated only the most effective, proven business and marketing frameworks. Our downloadable materials and audio guides will help you easily apply each framework. And the insights and advice you'll find across the site are based on 30 years of consulting experience from one of the world's leading business strategy experts, Paul Haig. B2B Frameworks is a small investment to advance your career or grow your business. Start your journey to becoming a successful business leader by joining B2B Frameworks today. Yeah. And as you say, it's that acting in urgent and unorthodox ways. And I think, I don't know whether it's in this part of the book, but the founder of Five Guys, Jerry Morrell, he was trying to get funding for his burger joint, but he was laughed out of banks when looking to scale as just, who go up against McDonald's, just another hamburger place. So he asked friends of his sons to loan them a payment for monthly return because he was so confident about his idea, and that fueled the growth in those early days and got them moving as well. So how you
and it's easier to get the son's parents to taste your burger and to come to your joint and see that you actually know what you're doing than it is to get the banker to do that. And so one of the things we did when we studied hustle was we looked across all of these different entrepreneurial stories of where an entrepreneur had engaged in hustle, and then said, what did it relate to, or what was the outcome of doing that? And we identified that it impacted at least five different things. And one was resourcing. So it allowed you to get resources that you wouldn't have otherwise got. And that's one of the examples. It allowed you to identify opportunities that others didn't see. It allowed you to marshal connections with other people that others wouldn't have otherwise gotten. It allowed you to learn in very interesting and valuable ways. So there were these multiple different outcomes of hustle, or effects of hustle, that had these sort of layering and building effects in these various different businesses that we studied.
Yeah, yeah. The third bucket is the resource bucket, and entrepreneurs are always, well, we just talked about it, haven't we? Almost always constrained with resources. So, am I assuming these principles are about how to overcome these constraints?
Yep, yep. And I mean, a big sort of challenge we need to overcome very often with first-time entrepreneurs or business school students who want to be entrepreneurial is they come in with a mindset that if I get the resources, I'll start the business. So I've got to come up. So the sort of mental model is I've got to come up with a good enough idea that I translate into a business plan that I pitch to an investor. If the investor likes what I've pitched, they'll give me the resources. Then I'll start the business. And it's a recipe for failure, because you essentially have done nothing to build the business. All you've got is an idea and some paper that says it might work, or that is a bunch of assumptions that you think might account for it working. And so one of the big things is, how do you make early stage progress without getting outside resources? Focus on what you've already got and build from what you've already got at your disposal, what you've got under your control, and be willing to put something of your own aside that you feel you can afford to lose. And those two things sort of work hand in hand, focusing on what's under your control and knowing what you can afford to lose, and leveraging those two things to create something without needing a bunch of outside resources. And then when you've built something, the resources will almost come to you. And I depend quite heavily on a pretty innovative and well-known sort of researcher in the entrepreneurial space by the name of Sarah Sarasvathy. She's at the University of Virginia, and she came up with a theory of entrepreneurship. And a big part of it is sort of this notion of what we call affordable loss, what I can afford to lose, and control, what leveraging what's under my control. And so those two things are they really transform your mindset about resources and about resourcing a new venture, and almost free you up to now go and do something, as opposed to waiting for resources so that you can do something.
Yeah, yeah. My particular journey, well, I suppose it's about knowing when to let go and focus on what's going to make the difference and the most money. And I started my original agency. It was called B2B International, a business to business market research agency, and that was in 1998, and it was very successful. But we were in this B2B niche of market research, and the lion's share was always, research was consumer research. It was, grass is greener over there. So, and because of our name, B2B International, we never really got the briefs for big consumer research studies. But we did a few, and we knew it was, we were more than capable of doing it. It's harder doing business to business research than it is consumer. So, so in 2012, we created a brand called Deep Sea. And that's been mothballed, although I've seen a lot of visitors to it recently with Deep Sea and everything. Yeah. But we ran the agency for nearly 6 years, worked with the likes of Mars and Britvic. But what we did realise is that we didn't really have a differentiated story, whereas our B2B specialism, we did. And so we took the decision, we closed the doors on Deep Sea in 2017. And in doing that, the trajectory of B2B International just took off as we were more focused then, and resources were pooled. So, I could see a lot of these principles on how we've tried different things. We've hustled, we've changed direction, and then we realized and came back to our core in terms of, what we were looking to really build from an agency point of view.
Yeah. And knowing what you're trying to build is valuable and important. Like, what are your desires? What trajectory are you trying to get yourself onto? And that's one of the things I lock into in that third bucket is sort of encouraging entrepreneurs to have an understanding of what different entrepreneurial trajectories can look like. Do you want to be more of a lifestyle entrepreneur and just sort of create something that then plateaus off and you keep running? Do you want to create something that's something similar to something that already exists but is on a growth trajectory, and you're willing to keep investing, keep looking for more opportunities, keep growing it? Or are you trying to be truly revolutionary, where you do something that hasn't been done before and you're trying to disrupt or revolutionize a market or create a new market? And really, those three as broad trajectories have very, very different sort of DNA to them, and different kind of decision making criteria, different investment profiles. And so understanding those and making sure as a team we're aligned in terms of thinking we're building a growth business, or we're building a lifestyle business, or we're trying to build a revolutionary business. And
Yeah.
because if the team's not aligned, you'll find that decision making becomes really muddled and people end up talking past each other and so on. So I've seen the sort of notion of articulating and understanding what trajectory you're on as being important and valuable as a mechanism for just sort of understanding what are we trying to do in a new business.
Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, like you say, you're describing that big picture bucket at the end there, and I found this fascinating because, as I looked at it, I was definitely a growth entrepreneur in my early years, driven all the time, scaling the business. But at the moment, I'm looking to build a new business, and I'm not sure if you know of paddle. It's a hybrid between squash
Yep,
and
yep, 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 yep.
it's booming over here in Europe, and I'm opening up some venues in the northwest of England, along with launching a clothing brand, and it's called Paddleista. This translates into paddle player in Spanish, but where I am in my life right now, I think I'm definitely more of a lifestyle entrepreneur in this new venture that I'm moving forward. So you can shift in your thinking as well, depending on the venture you're on, can't you?
Oh, 100%. And I mean, I think, it depends to some extent on the venture and what it takes to build it, and to some extent just on where you're at in life. And
Mm,
so I think, with the paddle business, if you're going to build the actual facilities, to be a growth entrepreneur, you would realize I'm going to need a constant supply of capital, because it's more investment, more real estate whenever I want to grow. Whereas if you're doing more of a lifestyle type business, you can say, well, I can figure out one chunk of capital and upfront investment, then get the business really ticking, make it work, and then I can make another decision. Do I want to franchise it in order to generate more growth? Do I just want to keep running it as it is and maybe layer on a few additional services and activities? So I think, being a growth entrepreneur with any kind of business that necessitates a high upfront investment to get it going, you need to then have access to capital to be able to do that. And so
yeah.
I think it's useful to think about those kind of businesses initially as lifestyle, get it working, and then make another decision about whether you want to transition it to growth or not.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we've got our first location secured. That's going to be opening the doors August, September this year. And then from there, we're looking as we move into spring, probably 26, and opening venture two then, and building it that way.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's
So in the
exciting.
US, in the US, it's all pickleball as opposed
Yeah,
to paddle, but it's the same kind of explosion that you see in South Africa. They're playing paddle. That's why I know so much about it. But it's the same kind of thing. These opportunities opening up because of a new sport suddenly becoming popular.
yeah. In fact, I was playing with a South African just yesterday on the courts here. So, and he was telling
Cool.
me, but you have the weather here in Manchester. Then it was grey skies overhead. Then, so Greg, having done all your research for the book, and we've mentioned a few examples, but you cite many examples within of how brands both succeeded and have failed. Just hearing on that failure side, why do you think most startups do fail?
Um, I mean, I think there's a number of different reasons. The basic notion of doing a startup is that there is uncertainty. And so there is going to be failure. And I think sort of getting a little bit comfortable with that as a notion is useful. But I think but then there are these things you can do to reduce the chance of failure or allow it to happen earlier so that you can learn sooner, so that you can move on to what might be successful. But I mean, underpinning it is just the notion that entrepreneurship is an adventure or an exploration into something that is less certain, that is not certain.
Yeah.
Now, in order to try and mitigate that, try and make clear choices about what you're doing and not doing, try and tell a clear story about what you're doing and not doing, try and build as soon as possible so that you can learn more quickly. But I don't view or see failure as necessarily a bad thing. And I think if you apply many of the principles in the book, like the affordable loss principle and the control principle, you'll find that even in the face of failure, there are opportunities to leverage that into some kind of success. Um, so I just think, as long as we live in a capitalist society that's structured the way it is, and we do, there are opportunities in starting new things, being entrepreneurial, innovating, there will be failure because the two are almost intertwined. And I think the bigger opportunity is to try and help at the individual level people become comfortable with trying something, if not working out, seeing it as an experiment and pivoting from that onto something that's got a higher likelihood of success.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you see any emerging trends that are shaping the future of entrepreneurship?
It's the biggest by far is artificial intelligence,
Yeah.
AI. I mean, it is radically speeding up how quickly you can build something, get it in front of customers, and allow them uh, to test it out on your behalf and give you feedback and so on. So, 2 weeks ago, we run something called the Idea Blitz here at the Kelley School of Business. 170 MBA students, all on campus for like a 3.5 day weekend, so a slightly extended weekend. And what they can build now during that time in order to test in the marketplace in real time is just unbelievable compared to what it was 2 years ago. And it's largely driven by AI. So AI is radically speeding up the entrepreneurial process and people's ability to build things, to gather information, to know what to ask when they go out and engage with customers. But then there overlaying that, or in addition to that, there are opportunities because of AI. So new entrepreneurial opportunities being created, new types of applications, new ways of gathering and utilizing data, new types of products that will exist because of AI. So there's this notion of AI both speeding up the entrepreneurial process, but then also creating a whole new range of entrepreneurial opportunities. And so that's by far the biggest thing that's sort of changing the landscape right now. And the third thing that it does is it typically makes things much cheaper to do. So it empowers individuals to do much more themselves, to become to be able to do some legal stuff, to do some financial modeling, to do some coding, and not have to hire specialists in all of those areas. And so it reduces the cost of going from zero to something substantially. So really, three major impacts of AI currently in the entrepreneurship space.
Yeah, and a lot of what we hear around AI and the jobs market is, that it's taking over roles. It's replacing people in doing those jobs. So, it's good to hear that AI is actually, this important tool that us as entrepreneurs can actually use to help to do something, to build our own business. And like you say, it can help in so many ways. all those different principles you talked about already, the prototyping, the resource factor, the speed, and being able to hustle and create something and put it to market to get that feedback. AI really is something in the toolbox that can help across many broad principles.
Yeah, so I do think it will take away some jobs or make some jobs less valuable, but it is on an individual level empowering people to do new things, and hence the idea of entrepreneurship in the age of AI, I think, suddenly radically increases because large corporations are not going to need as many people doing as many jobs in the way that they used to. But there are many more opportunities that are existing for smaller, lean, nimble agencies, consultancies, freelancers, businesses operating on a relatively small scale, going after a particular niche, leveraging AI to create a whole lot of value in that niche. So I think AI opens up the sort of entrepreneurial society like we haven't seen before.
Yeah. Yeah. This podcast is sponsored by B2B Frameworks, and you reference many frameworks in your book. Do you have a favorite business framework specific to entrepreneurial progress that we haven't talked about today?
So, if I take a framework that is outside of one that I've developed and sort of use, but one that I consistently go back to, it would be the business model canvas framework. So I do reference that
Right.
in the book. I've got the principle of what I call the integration principle, which is integrating everything into a coherent business model. And it's been around for about 15 years. I don't think there's any framework that within its 15-year life cycle has had such a big impact on so many different types of businesses, from startups to social ventures to larger organizations trying to understand or reconfigure their business model. I find a lot of my teaching involves case studies. I find you can better understand almost any case study by distilling what it's doing into a business model as a starting point. And I find that it creates a great platform for having conversation, for understanding assumptions and having conversations about a new business. So, and then there are all these derivative frameworks that have come off the back of the business model canvas, value proposition canvas, and so on and so on. And so I think it's been a great platform for a sort of a new wave of thinking in the business space generally, but more specifically in the innovation earlier stage venture business space.
Yeah. Well, there's your book on the shelf there, but you can see next to it is uh, there's four books actually that I've got from Alex Osterwalder, who
Yeah.
put the business framework together, and he was a previous guest on the podcast. So if any listeners are really interested in that, it's a fabulous discussion with Alex. So definitely dip into that one.
Yeah,
To
and
conclude,
that was actually the first time I listened to your podcast, was because I heard that he had been on it. So
okay.
that's what sort of got me onto this channel.
In fact, I remember, Greg, and then you said, "Oh, I've got a book. I think it might be interesting for your listeners." You sent it to me. I read it, and definitely agreed with you. So here we are. So yeah, Alex has got us to thank for speaking in the first instance. So that's great. To conclude, I just want to finish on my regular questions. And firstly, I always take a couple of questions from our listeners. So Dale Clark from London, he asks, should governments play a more active role in fostering entrepreneurship through policies, funding, and support programs, or does too much intervention stifle innovation?
So, I mean, I think of a government's role as being one of two things. I do think that smaller scale, earlier stage grants that give people the opportunity to test out things and try things can be quite fruitful. But I don't think government should be playing a heavy hand in saying, we're going to offer these huge grants for businesses to do certain things in certain areas. So I'm in favor of sort of a government playing the role of planting many seeds or and giving them a little bit of water and then seeing what happens and allowing normal capitalism to take over after that. And that's on the sort of funding and enablement side. And then the other major thing that I think governments can do is create both policies and a culture where if someone has failed as an entrepreneur, they are not ridiculed or it doesn't count against them in too great a way. So, in certain places in Africa, if you failed once and you've had one bankruptcy, you're never going to get any credit again. And
Right.
that's just destructive. And it creates sort of these golden handcuffs for people where they don't want to try anything that's new or innovative because the costs of that in the long term are just too high. So I think stepping back as a government and saying, how can we make the costs of business failure be less on an individual? Now, there's always going to be some cost, but be less on an individual over the long term. I think then you start to see people more willing to take risks, to bear the uncertainty, and to go and do things. So that's the major thing I would step back and ask questions about. And in fact, the US is quite favorable in that regard, that a bankruptcy or a failure is not seen as too much of a black mark. But having spent time in South Africa and other parts of the world, I know that this is a major factor that's impeding people actually starting businesses.
Yeah. Yeah, and when I saw this question come in, I mean, I don't know where Dale's coming from there, but what I do know is here in the UK, since Labour came into power in last July, then, well, I saw it just this week, 10,800 millionaires have left the UK due to tax changes and the UK's diminished role in global technology sector. So it's not this fertile environment anymore. I mean, if you look back in the early 2000s, it really was that environment then. And like you say, it's a bit different to the South African example, but yeah, it's not this environment that's innovating entrepreneurs to really play their hand and stay here in the UK. So they're looking at places like Dubai, Singapore, the States, which are a lot more favourable now, which is proving a problem, or definitely will prove a problem, I'm sure, for entrepreneurial spirit in the future.
Yeah, so just to reinforce that, a useful thing to do is to, from a policy standpoint, is to number one, try and retain people who've developed some sort of personal wealth, and number two, try and uh, facilitate favorable conditions for them to invest in other businesses. Make the tax breaks appropriate for that, and because that's one of the major areas. If we study on a region by region basis in the US, you'll see in places where other individuals have made quite a lot of money, you suddenly have an uptick of entrepreneurial activity, very often because they're willing to write a seed check to support, to help other people starting new businesses. So the more you can facilitate some of that sort of willingness to, on the part of wealthier individuals to support others, you'll also see an uptick in entrepreneurship.
Yeah, yeah. Secondly, this is from Christy Lawrence on the other side of the world in Melbourne, and she asks, many entrepreneurs feel pressure to scale their businesses quickly, but is this always the right approach? Are there benefits to staying small and focused, and why don't we hear more about these stories?
So I think this is a great question, and it's one that I think generally us as academics, the media, and others need to think a lot more carefully about is what entrepreneurial stories are we telling. And I
Mm,
know I fell into the trap in the book I wrote, is that you go to the stories that you know people like, and they're often the more high profile stories, but they're also the ones of rapid scaling, rapid growth, and rapid success. And we land up losing out on the much richer, broader myriad of stories of people who've started less sexy, less elaborate businesses, but businesses that have really allowed them as individuals to thrive and succeed. And so I don't have a good answer for to this question, but I do. It does prompt me to question how can I uncover and tell more of those slower scaling, more sustainable kind of business stories, and how can I bring them into the classroom and make them understandable to students so that they don't believe that the only path to being an entrepreneur is to be the next Airbnb or the next Canva or the next whatever it might be, but to opening up 2 or 3 paddle facilities and building a business in that way is in many cases almost more financially profitable because you're not going to need a ton of outside capital to do it. And how do you tell those stories so that people can learn from all sides of the equation? So
Yeah.
I don't have a good answer, but I am inspired by the question to tell more of those stories.
Jenny Romaniak, she's international director of the Ehrenberg Bass Institute in Australia, and she was my previous guest on the podcast. And she asked you, Greg, do entrepreneurs make more type 1 or type 2 errors? And in other words, what holds entrepreneurs back? Do they fail to act when they should, or do they act when they shouldn't?
So, I mean, I think there's a distinction between um, different types of entrepreneurs here. And I don't think you can categorize them all as making one type of error or the other. I do think across the population, more broadly, the errors that are made are people failing to act when they should. So, recognizing there's an opportunity, knowing that they could go after something, but held back by a lack of confidence or an unwillingness to take risks.
Yeah.
But if you took a small segment of people who've already made the jump into entrepreneurship, um, you'll probably find that it's at least a more even split between people doing things without any sense of purpose to what they're doing and just trying stuff and seeing whether it sticks. And so, versus not doing things when they should. So once people have almost crossed the Rubicon into entrepreneurship, I think that you probably get a sort of even split of those types of errors, but across the broad population, most certainly it's the error of not acting is the greater of the errors that I think entrepreneurs make or
Yeah.
that people make.
Yeah. What's the best piece of business advice you've ever been given?
Uh, that's a really good question. Um, I mean, I've just always uh, gone back to this sort of notion of have a bias towards action, take
Mm.
action, see what happens, learn from it, and I've always found that has helped me. So I think business advice is almost relevant at a personal level. Like, what's going to be your blocker? And my blocker is going to be overthinking something, waiting to act, trying to
Yeah.
overanalyze it and rationalize it. And so by someone telling me that successful people have a bias towards action and me remembering that in those moments, it's pushing me beyond my blocker. Now, I think someone else's piece of business advice might be, think before you act, which would be invalid or inappropriate for me, but might be very appropriate for them because of their natural inclination. So I think part of being successful in terms of taking on advice is recognizing what are your blockers, what are the things that are going to stand in your way.
Yeah. And there's different circumstances, isn't there, on why, how, and why. Might be push and pull factors on how you do actually create something. But one of my guests 2 shows ago, Greg Hahn, he's chief creative officer, and he set up Mischief, which are now in the States, they were ranked 20th or top 20 most creative companies in the world, alongside the likes of Tesla and Apple. And that was all from him being forced through a redundancy in COVID. It forced his hand, and he would never have done that, he said, because it was an unknown, there was risks, and he was quite comfortable. But something forced him, and look where it's taken him. So
Yeah. And many of the best things that I've landed up creating, whether it's a class or a new way of teaching or whatever it might be, has often been because I've been forced into that scenario. And so, we got to embrace those moments where we're forced to do things and say, what's the opportunity here?
Yeah. Who would you like me to reach out and invite to come on this podcast in the future, Greg?
So this, because I saw this question beforehand, this kept me up last night, because the list is like so long and varied and so on. And but I mean, the one person I think that I would love to hear, because I've seen how you conduct this and how good your questions are and so on. The one person that I think would be interesting to talk to is Shane Parrish. He wrote Clear Thinking and runs the Farnham Street blog. And I think
Right.
he has a very interesting sort of angle on things like business frameworks and bits of advice, and has spoken to many interesting people and sort of channeled it in a very valuable way. So that's certainly one. The other two people that came to mind are Dan Heath. I've just read over my spring break last week his new book. You can see it's even messed up, called Reset. And it's really well done, very interesting learning. And one of the things he does so well is he tells unknown stories. So you're never hearing the same story that you've heard before. So he's got some way of uncovering the right story for the right lesson at the right time. And I think there's some value in that. And then the other person I always love hearing on podcast is Aswath Damodaran, the finance professor from NYU, who's really just understands valuation. But I love his theory about corporate life cycles and how businesses go through these life cycles and what implications it has for their strategy, their financial structure, and different major decisions at different stages of their life cycle.
Well, that's great, Greg. Well, there you go. There's three guests there. That's going to take up a month's worth of podcasts that I can put out there. So I'll reach out to all three, because each one sounds like they've got a really nice angle and different take on and bringing something to what our listeners are looking for. So thanks for that. Well, finally, my next guest is Fred Reichheld, American New York Times bestselling author, speaker, business strategist, famously the creator of the Net Promoter Score of management. What question would you like to ask Fred?
So I'll start off by saying the Net Promoter Score, I think, is brilliant. So simple, provides such actionable advice. It generates variance like almost no other instrument we've ever seen. So, I mean, I think it's just a fascinating tool. And so, I mean, what I would love to know from him, having brought this thing to bear, seen it scale out and proliferate the way it has, is what other areas could we use a very simple tool like that to collect actionable data that would potentially transform a domain? Has he applied his mind to where there might be another very simple, very actionable, data rich, sort of in the moment tool that could be applied and then used to create value that we're not getting valuable data right now? So something along those lines. Where else might we see the like we see the Uber for this and the Uber for that and the Uber for this? Where else might we see the Net Promoter Score for this, and this? What are the other areas?
Yeah, a great question. And one that comes back to, we started talking early on about the simplicity principle, making sure that's why it's had legs and traveled so far. It's just that simplistic way of building the question and then the answers and then the action that you can take on the back of it. And in fact, we'll be digging into his books, Winning on Purpose, one of the more recent ones as well. So that's coming up in the next podcast.
Cool. It should be a good discussion.
Okay, well, hopefully today's conversation has shone a light on the fact that entrepreneurs work under conditions of uncertainty, as competitors are constantly acting themselves. So, but technology is changing, politics is shifting, the economy is going through various different cycles. I definitely recommend our listeners to go out there and buy Greg's book. It's an excellent read, and following those principles in your book can definitely increase the chances of making meaningful progress. It doesn't guarantee success, of course, and I think that's probably come through hopefully today. Success is never a sure thing, but it can definitely help you along the way. If our listeners are interested in buying the book or just asking you a question, getting in touch, Greg, how should they do that? How best to get in touch?
Buying the book, Amazon is the easiest just to do it. Just look for Principles of Entrepreneurial Progress. Getting in touch with me, the easiest way to do it is just to search for me on LinkedIn and message me on LinkedIn, connect with me on LinkedIn. Otherwise, just go direct to the Kelley School of Business website, and you can look up my email address there and send me an email. So those are the two easiest ways to connect with me.
Fabulous. Well, I need to thank you, Greg, for connecting in the first instance, because as you reminded me today, you reached out after Alex's podcast, sent me the book, and I absolutely loved it. So thanks again for doing that. Thanks again for your time and a fabulous discussion today. So thank you for that.
Great to meet you, Nick. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Greg. This podcast has been brought to you in partnership with Awards International. Awards International is dedicated to running successful business awards programs and conferences. Founded in 2008 by Don Hales and Neil Skihel, the company's core mission centers on honoring and celebrating exceptional achievements in customer and employee experience, but also in overall business excellence across diverse sectors. In addition, their aim is to showcase best practices, innovations, and achievements that contribute positively to these areas, ultimately inspiring other organizations to improve their own customer experience, employee engagement strategies, and overall business success. To find out more about Awards International and how to register your interest in their awards programs, check their website www.awardsinternational.com.